Todos, es un placer tenerles hoy aquí.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Before we start, I'd like to tell you there is available simultaneous interpretation. There's an icon in the bottom of your screen. You may find the interpretation icon and you may choose
Good morning,
the
everybody.
language of your preference.
UN Environment Program. Before we start, I would like to inform that we have interpretation services. You can choose down in the screen, in the interpretation button, the language of your preference between Spanish and English. And if you have any query, please, you can write in the chat and we can address it. Bueno, bienvenidos al lanzamiento del reporte Midiendo el Progreso.
Welcome to the launching event, Measuring Progress, the environmental dimension of the SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a great pleasure for me to launch this report where we've been working for a year now. And I wanted to, first of all, pass on the floor to Leo Hellman, Regional Director of the Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, so that he gives us the opening remarks and he leads us to the presentation of the report itself. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Piedad, and good morning to everyone. Welcome to this session on the launch of the report on measuring progress in environmental dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals in Latin America and the Caribbean. As included in the 2030 Agenda, sustainability includes balancing the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of our development. We see now that it's quite important to include the health dimensions as we are seeing the great impact that COVID is having on our society. That is why environmental issues are included in all the Sustainable Development Goals, linked to topics such as poverty, resilience, hunger, health, water, energy, employment, and innovation. Unfortunately, as we will see later, the environmental dimension is being left behind as it is the one with less production of data, information, and indicators, and progress is not being made globally at a sufficiently rapid pace. Particularly concerning is the fact that the targets related to biodiversity conservation are not being met, as shown in our recent report on the state of biodiversity. None of the Aichi targets are being fully met. This is of grave concern. This UNEP's regional report aims to bring our attention to two main issues. One, the linkages between environment and all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are expressed in practical terms in the inclusion of SDG indicators related to the environment in all of them. Secondly, there is also a relationship and synergies between the targets defining the SDGs and the multilateral environmental agreements. This is included in the document as well. By compiling the information of the 88 SDG indicators related to environmental issues, the report that we are launching today collects the richness of the connections between people, nature, and the economy of the 33 countries of the Latin American and Caribbean region. So why should we measure progress? Because our own livelihoods suffer dreadful consequences when ecological limits are not respected. Pollution, disasters, human health, zoonosis, and in the same way, if natural resources are not rationally managed, will be impairing future generations' capacities to have the same ecological goods, environmental and ecosystem services as we have today. This is not based only on a precautionary principle of harm and risk reduction, but rather on the role of natural resources to ensure human well-being. In the long term, if inadequate patterns of progress prevail, economic growth can hamper our ability to survive. The current context of COVID-19 and its link to this report. The set of upheavals of COVID-19's pandemic in 2020 will surely go down in history as one of the greatest health, social, and economic crises humanity has ever faced. 2020 also marks the beginning of a decisive decade for the future of our society in the face of the effects of climate change and the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These demand from humanity a coordinated, effective, and transparent action given the magnitude of the consequences we are facing and the little time that remains to ensure that the impacts and costs are as low as possible. The immediate impacts of COVID-19 have made us act in the first instance towards the protection of human life and health. We have also understood in much greater detail the value of the conservation of ecosystems and the species that inhabit them, making us reflect that nature is our greatest ally in the prevention of future events similar to COVID-19. Nature is also a strategic resource to increase our capacities to adapt to extreme climatic events and to capture the carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere. In Latin America and the Caribbean, post-COVID-19 recovery plans and national determined contributions take the highest relevance as instruments of action in the face of health, economic, and climate emergencies. In this complex scenario, the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2030 Agenda take a fundamental role in establishing the guidelines for economic recovery and the climate action, aimed at guiding humanity on a path of peace, equity, justice, and sustainability during the next decade and beyond. Through this review of the environmental dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have been able to identify important results and challenges faced by governments in the framework of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. This report provides information on the status of 88 indicators that are key to achieve a sustainable path. Why is this report important? First of all, in the region, it's the first that we have produced in the region. Secondly, it identifies how environment is related to each of the Sustainable Development Goal topics. It also maps the advances in terms of policies and institutional arrangements. And it presents information for the countries, per country. The information has already shown its usefulness as we have used the database to provide input to the voluntary national reviews and the common country assessments that are developed by each country with the United Nations country team. The report not only shows progress in the different environmental topics concerned, but also helps to identify how well and how deep we are measuring such progresses and where the data gaps are. I would like to highlight the ambition, transparency, and usefulness with which the majority of the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean are acting in the face of the emergency, while adapting to the effects of the changing climate and guiding their development decisions towards a path of neutrality in their greenhouse gas emissions. Decisions regarding energy, infrastructure, the creation of new jobs, and the conservation of ecosystems must be motivated by the decarbonization of economies, the neutrality of emissions, the increase in adaptive capacity, and the absolute halt of the loss of biodiversity. When incorporated transparently into the NDCs, post-COVID recovery plans, and the development decisions, these policies will ensure a decade of change and transformation of our region towards a resilient future, neutral in emissions, and prepared for future crises. We would like this report to contribute to reform these decisions. We invite you to share and disseminate this report and use it with this objective in mind. Thank you very much. And now we will have a video presentation from Costa Rica. So I would like to introduce the message from the Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, Ms. Andrea Mesa, who unfortunately could not be with us today in person. As Vice President of the United Nations Environmental Assembly and member of the International Resource Panel, she would have very much liked to be with us today, but she is kindly obliged to send this video message to share with you all. Please put up the video. Thank you very much.
Los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible constituyen un
SDGs are a call, a universal call to action to end poverty, protect our planet, and improve the lives and the perspectives of lives throughout the world. The General Secretary of the United Nations made a call so that all sectors of society mobilize in favor of a decade of action at 3 levels worldwide to guarantee more leadership, more resources, and more intelligent solutions regarding our SDGs. Local action as well to include the necessary transitions in public policies, budgets, institutions, and the regulatory frameworks of the governments, cities, and local authorities. And action from people, including the young, the civil society, the media, the private sector, unions, academia, to create a movement, an unstoppable movement that will drive this transformational change. Today, the Regional Office of United Nations Environmental Program for Latin America and the Caribbean is presenting this progress called Measuring Progress, the environmental dimension of SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean. This report shows how environmental considerations are key to achieve these SDGs. We cannot create well-being, economic or social well-being, unless we consider the well-being of the ecosystems. There is a very close relation between the condition of the environmental concern, the environmental realm, and the objectives that we need to achieve in the different areas related to poverty, vulnerable populations, and many other conditions to achieve that 2030 agenda. The environmental elements are then a key part of our development models. The video stopped.
We seem to have some technical difficulties. Can this be resolved?
The video is not playing anymore.
Okay, well, in that case, I think we will continue while we try and resolve this issue, but thank you so much for very kind words that are expressed by the Minister of Costa Rica. It is now time to present the main contents and findings of the report. And I would like really to invite Piedad Martin from the UNEP's regional office to present them before counting on the interventions of our guest. Piedad?
Muchas gracias, Leo. Sí, voy a hacer la presentación en
Thank you
español.
very much. I'm going to speak Spanish, even though it's being shown in English, just to make it easier for everyone. It's just a brief summary of what the report is about, what information it contains to give everyone a better reason to read it, share it, and use it. The next slide. Basically, I'll be presenting in my 20 minutes what the objective is, this method and structure, some of the key messages, and for some of the SDGs, we have wanted to highlight some of the main highlights to give you an idea of the information it contains. The overall objective has been to identify clearly the environmental aspects of each one of the SDGs. The 2030 agenda starts with integrating philosophy. It mentions that the three dimensions provide the coherence, give coherence to policies if they are used equally, environmental, social, and economic dimensions. However, we have gone into the detail as to what are the environmental aspects in each SDG that must be highlighted. Also, the objective has been to show the current status of that information in Latin America and the Caribbean and per country as well. It's also important that we should highlight we're not only showing data regionally, but also to the extent possible, we have made our greatest effort to show information per country. And we've used the information based on the environment related SDGs that have to do with the environment. And according to a publication and a previous analysis that UNDP had introduced its 88 indicators. I'd like to move on to the next slide, please, so that you can see a chart. It's a summary as to what the 88 indicators are that are related to the environment. And as you can see, they're linked to all the 17 SDGs. So we will take a
Introducir estos
moment
elementos y la manera más
to introduce these elements, and the most practical way to reflect it, analyze it, assess it, and quantify it is through indicators. Is the most complete and reliable information we have. The structure of the report has been tried to rescue, as we said before, specific information per country. We've covered the 33 countries in the Latin American and the Caribbean, including SIDS. SIDS, as we're going to see later, not all the SDGs are available, not all the indicators. There's a process to generate such indicators globally, but in that case, we have taken on the task to look for alternative sources and proxy indicators. So we have tried to cover everything, all the topics of the SDG indicators and the goals. However, in some cases, we still do not have information with the indicator. We have also wanted to give this report, it's a database, a full database that we have. We have wanted to give it a very visual image so that the information may be understood and may be queried more easily because it's a lot of information that it contains. Method and structure, what you'll find there, of course, an introduction, but especially a chapter for each one of the SDGs, where we establish what are the international agreements on the environment that relate to that specific SDG. What are the what are the agreements that have already been achieved in other frameworks other than the 2030 agenda and are related to the SDGs in general? What are the SDGs environmental related targets and also the SDG environmental indicators and statuses? Then after that, each chapter develops subsections for these topics, which are very wide depending on every one of the SDGs, and they include a great variety of topics. So we have tried to uh, eh, break down what the status is. The main messages of the report, the key message it establishes how the environment and also the multilateral environmental agreements are linked to all the SDGs. And then you'll be able to find per SDG the reference to it. For example, what goals relate to the biodiversity convention, the Paris Agreement. It might sound obvious, but You need to see how each one relates to the others, and it has to do with goals that are in the energy SDG, poverty SDG, that has to do with resilience. So we establish all these linkages in a very concise manner. The next key message is that the status of the environmental indicators in the region. Of course, we find some positive trends in some of them and negative trends in others. For example, SDG 12, as you can see on the right hand of the table, it has more red color, greater bar of red color. This is the trend there. But especially what we found is that there is 70% of the indicators that have or don't have data, or it's insufficient data. And that is really important because it calls our attention in the generation of more information. Like I said, the report has tried to rescue information from other sources of the World Bank and so on that approximate these indicators, but we continue to have deficiency, a shortage in measuring and evaluating the status of the environment in many of the critical aspects that create these indicators. Another key message is that in spite of the fact that we do have information per country, we need more data and disaggregation. Data generation capacities are different amongst countries, and of course, environmental indicators, some of them for their nature because of mission, those are the ones that can be disaggregated per gender or societal group. It's a very important part of the agenda not to leave everyone behind by 2030. So it's a space to disaggregate not only geographical but also by population group and based on the indicators. The map is a map we got from uh, ECLAC. It talks about the SDGs in Latin America, and SDG indicators is more than 54, well, about 54%. As we saw, the environmental dimension here has a less generation of indicators. So we have
los océanos, la lucha contra el cambio climático, nos parecía muy importante destacarla, ¿no? Y hay temas, sobre todo con cambios de uso del suelo muy importantes, con la ampliación de la frontera agrícola y urbana y algunas áreas que resalta el informe de especial preocupación como los Andes, el Chaco.
are highlighted in the report, for example, Andes and other regions. And finally, there are some topics, recurring topics, of course, related to governance, society, and the environment, as to how the region has made a lot of progress in managing environmental topics, but still, in spite of the generation of policies, is still pending to implement them, deployment, enforcement in the territories, and to enforce the international agreements as well as the public policies. And of course, that impacts several of the SDGs. So these topics, we felt they were recurrent and important because maybe if these can be discussed in detail, we could make progress in all the SDGs and environmental dimension itself, not having to go goal by goal or objective by objective. Some of the important data that we wanted to highlight, so you may see the scope of the report.
Por ejemplo,
On the one hand, we have the relation between poverty and the environment. It seems like one of the most important SDG is in agenda that is very much highlighted with the slogan, it's not to leave anyone behind, is the fight, the struggle against poverty. And it relates to the dimension of the environment. There we have wanted to highlight that there are several countries in the region that have already incorporated the environmental dimension in the multi-dimension measurement of poverty, which is an important base to coordinate these two policies. It doesn't happen in all countries, but there is great progress, and we felt it was important to highlight it. For example, SDG, the fight against hunger, that includes agriculture. Yes, it's pending in the agenda to create more sustainable agriculture. This use of pesticides, for example, is always on the rise in all the subregions, and it is an indicator that we are not being as sustainable in this sector, this very important sector of the economy in our region. On the other hand, there's some good news as to how the region is preserving biodiversity and especially agriculture and ecological biodiversity and many centers of conservation for species, for example, corn, potato, and other grains that is present in the region. They're making efforts to preserve it. Another important topic related to health. Of course, here we have included everything about the zoonosis risk, especially because of the situation where we are in right now. But there are some indicators that are important per country. For example, on mortality, uh, non-intentional poisoning, for example. It means poisoning because of chemicals that are in the homes, pesticides, kerosene, mercury that may be found in mining activities, to see what the situation is in each country and what the rate is and how it is progressing, if it's getting worse or better. And well, there's still a lot of work to do. I wanted to highlight as well in the case of gender, there's a specific gender equality, but of course, it's a topic that is goes across all the agenda and it has to do with environmental concerns. For example, we highlight they have regulations that will allow equal access to uh, property to women. However, when you look at the property records, you see that still women have less access to land ownership and, of course, the natural resources, less than men, I mean. And of course, the technical assistance processes and technical assistance only get to 12% of women. On the other hand, we also see there's been good progress, especially with multilateral environmental agreements to include gender. For example, the Biodiversity Convention adopted an action plan on gender. We have information as to what are the countries that have included this in their national biodiversity strategies. They include gender equality and they have national goals regarding women and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Another topic we wanted to highlight that was interesting is energy, and it relates to the key messages from the beginning. Even the region has the cleanest energy matrix in the world, it's in the rise, especially the use of fossil fuels. During the last 50 years, it has more than doubled, it has tripled. Even though a lot of investments have been made in renewable energies, we can see the specific data here in the report. The proportion of renewable energy in the matrix has not increased. It has actually decreased from 33% to 24%. So this is
Sostenibilidad también para la lucha contra el cambio climático y que hay también una atención dispar entre los países. Hay países que han avanzado más en neutralizar sus emisiones.
Emissions with the energy matrix and others still have great opportunities to make it even greener. Regarding production and sustainable consumption, something that we saw that the trends are pretty negative. This has to do a lot with the consumption of materials per GDP unit in the region is not very efficient in comparison to other regions. And we wanted to highlight the issue of waste, where we have data, of course, with the sensibility of the case, because there isn't any homogeneous statistics in the region for waste management, but we do have data on per capita waste generation. Most of them are organic, so there's a great opportunity for recycling. And the region has 13 of the 50 biggest dump sites in the world. It's also a concern, as we can see on the graph in the right-hand side, the yellow dot means recycling. The Latin American and the Caribbean region has the lowest recycling rate in the world. It's also one of the regions with, or in the list, in the main places for in waste recycling or waste pickup. So there are opportunities to improve this. I want to highlight three more SDGs regarding climate change. We have highlighted information or rescue information, only extreme events and disasters, as you can see here in this graph, how they have increased, both of them, the um, the number of events as well as the number of people who have been impacted. Of course, there are some peaks because it depends on the years and the level of the disaster, the impact of the disaster, but there's a trend to go up, to increase. So I invite you to see in the report the number of climate funds that are coming to a region because they know that SDG is also incorporating implementation means, and one of them is to make available some finances. And we have analyzed data as to how much funding comes from the Green Climate Fund and how much it gets to countries, and from all the funds and the financial flows related to the climate that come to a region, only 10% is from developed countries. So there's a lot of disparity, and there's a big need to continue to compensate this one of the most vulnerable regions in the planet. About biodiversity, as you know, there's always a concern on the deforestation rate and the variation in the forest area. The region, of course, has several countries, specifically six of them, that have a positive trend in forests. I mean, they've made very big efforts to reforest and recover areas. And so we need to congratulate, especially the Caribbean. There's a great increase of protected areas and biodiversity protected areas. There's still more room, of course, to comply with the Biodiversity Convention goals. And we wanted to highlight there's not enough data for each individual country, but for those that we do have it, there is a problem with the illegal trafficking of species, especially birds and reptiles, and especially countries that have relation to the Amazon, where they have Amazon regions. We can see the official data on the right-hand side, how many events have been identified in these countries of illegal trafficking of species. And of course, we believe that the problem is actually bigger. So it's also something to keep in mind. And finally, just to tell you about one more SDG and create the interest to see the report, SDG 16 on governance. We have identified what instruments there are, what institutions there are. We've looked at participation of the government, justice, human rights defenders, environmental rights defenders. It's all included in the Escazú agreement, but we've also seen very positively that it's one of the regions with more national institutions that incorporate the right to a healthy environment, which has facilitated a whole legislation development, also institutions around complying with this right and the status where we are right now with a very well developed institution level. One thing is the legislation development, a different thing is the challenges there are to put them into practice, to enforce them. So there is still room there for improvement and to use the environmental topics as a foundation to improve coexistence, the Pacific coexistence and progress in other dimensions of sustainable development. Finally, I'd like to leave you with the link to the report. I want to tell you that all this work is based on a database, is very thorough per country with all the information. We've made it available to the teams of the United Nations and the country teams, for example, to produce voluntary reports for the United Nations on SDGs, also for the preparation of what we call the common country analysis that the UN looks at every time they're going to have a cooperation agreement. Of course, they're available for any liaison that we may reach, any other stakeholder that may be interested in using this information or supporting also any may be useful and get to more people. The report is the expression of the work, but there is this tool that we can use for decision making, and we believe it's important. And no further be said. I want to say that we will be making this recording available to everyone. And I want to welcome our guest speakers so that they provide some insights as to how they see this work, what their reaction is, how it may be applied. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I'm going to pass the floor to Cepei Director. Welcome, Philip. Okay, yes. Leo and Piedad, thank you very much for the invitation and thank you for making us part to be able to talk about the report during 5 minutes. It's very optimistic, and I can see has a lot of data we can share. I believe that I should first congratulate you, Piedad, and the whole team that was involved because I know how hard it is to work on this type of report. But it has given us the first response to what you were asking about in the presentation of the report is how it's being linked. The environmental component is linked to the SDGs, and I believe that it actually the report has been able to show that. It showed that the data are supporting these linkages. I wanted to highlight, especially when you talk about data and disaggregation of data, this is not something new. We've heard it once and over again, but the new thing is to have the evidence, what the actual data tell us. And this report gives us this possibility, and it sends some recurrent messages that were mentioned on governance, uh, society, and environment. And here I'd like to react on the realities and utopias of what we see in the report and how far we are also, in some cases, to be able to comply with that promise of strong governance, society, and environment where there is an enabling mood so that all the stakeholders may participate. Here, I wanted to talk about the national development plans that you have also studied. We felt it was very important that 15 of the 33 countries place as a priority climate change and the development in the national development goals. However, only 8 of those 15 mention the Paris Agreement. It means the international commitments were not clear. And the most important thing is that all the approved national plans since 2018 that are five in all, we see that none of them mentions the Escazú agreement. And that is also a big concern. It makes us wonder, is this data giving us the necessary information about the participation and access to data? And I believe it's one of the points that we may highlight a little bit more. Another example that I believe when you started with the report and when you completed it, the timings changed a lot. And COVID, what it allowed us is also to see what are the responses for the recovery of 15 countries in the region where the United Nations contributed to uh, this kind of with this assistance. We saw that only 4 of these plans have an environmental dimension and also institutions that were in charge of the environment and involved in it. And those 4 are Colombia, Costa Rica, Peru, and I didn't hear the other one. That also shows how we can translate all this data into a reality of governance and how we can actually interact with the other stakeholders. The third point I wanted to mention is the relation that we see with SDGs and the governance. That's what the report tells us. If we see that the as Ministry of the Environment only are only have almost 60, 17 countries are participating in the SDG commissions. That compared to 24 cases of the ministries of housing. So we still see the dimensions of the sustainable development in an unbalanced way in favor of the environment and also the institutions that are involved in the SDGs. And finally, I'd like to mention a topic that you also touched in the report, which is the voluntary reports that have been submitted before the United Nations. There we see that there is a lack of balance, actually, that only 14 of the 26 reports that have been submitted to this point from countries in the region, we have an actual balance of the three dimensions on sustainable development. So all of this is to say that we still have important work to do in governance itself to have access and better access to these data that you are showing. The report will help and will help us a lot to close those gaps on information, but a lot more. And this is what I'm interested in leaving behind or the takeout to see in the future what sustainability we can give to this report, this type of report, how we can build on it and improve the data and the sources as such that were queried to close the information gaps. And hopefully in the future, when you present it, we could see also what data is being used, what data could be used by regional bodies, by private or public institutions that may aid a lot in closing those information gaps. So those are the 5 minutes I had. I think I took even more longer than the 5 minutes, but I wanted to emphasize especially these points of the report. Like I said, it invites to optimism. It brings new data and new evidence, which will be very helpful for the work that we need to do to recover after the pandemic. That we still see uh, the recovery far away, but we definitely can give more relevance to the environmental component. So once again, thank you for giving me these 5 minutes. And also, I had the great pleasure to say hello to my colleagues who are online, and they will be making their comments. Thank you. Goodbye.
Muchas gracias, Philip. Y sí, estamos hoy celebrando que
Yes,
lanzamos
thank you. We are celebrating that we launched the report. We're happy because it was very exhausting work, but also concerned because, as I said, there are some core points of the region's development model that, unless they change, they will not support sustainable development throughout this decade. And we see with an optimistic eye that the environmental topics have gained momentum in the agenda. There's a concern from people in the region, especially in this post-COVID situation, but there is social responsibility, everything about the crisis, and it'll be a big challenge to continue. So thank you. I want to pass on the floor to Rosa Castizo. She's from, I'm sorry, her voice froze. She'll be sharing her impressions with us. Rosa, you're welcome. Thank you very much, Piedad. Congratulations for your report, on your report. Especially, as I said before, thank you very much. Thank you because it was necessary to have this kind of report, and we were awaiting this just like all other colleagues from the observatory. We were awaiting this moment when the report was launched. Well, the observatory on climate change was built in the framework of the General Secretariat, in the framework of the American Summit on Government. So the idea of our observatory has been to work on the environmental component, yes, on sustainable development, and with the framework of the 2030 agenda. And we built a report 2 years ago from different sectors, more specific sectors that we know how complex it is to try to raise and gather this information, as it's been shown uh, the fact that there is no data and there aren't many indicators. Well, it's something that we need to pay attention to. To us as an observatory, for the Secretariat, which in the end is bringing together the commitments and the dialogue of the different countries, it's very useful to have this information because it's not just only useful for decision makers in the countries, but also in the dialogue and the this uh, interaction between stakeholders, because the agenda is not only on SDGs, but it's a different way of behaving, a different way of creating liaisons, partnerships, and to work at all levels. And there, the environmental layer is key. And the report then we feel is very clear, is very relevant in terms of the conclusions, the direct actions, not just for decision makers at the government level, but also when we want to speed up the commitments of the business sector, the civil society. I feel then that there is there's a lot to highlight and to take direct action in each one of the SDGs. From that viewpoint, really, thank you very much because it is going to be a great tool for work every day, especially for the stakeholders that work together with the observatory for us. Let's not forget that precisely 3 months ago, more than 2 months, more or less 2 months better, we held the conference on the ministries, I mean, ministers of the environment in Iberoamerica, and we came to the agreement to work on an environmental agenda in the region. That environmental agenda will, of course, include dialogue with other ministries from other sectors, and also according to the summit that will be held in April. So they're having a tool such as the one that is provided by this report with such a specific conclusion, and then be able to see how we articulate that environmental agenda with Iberoamerica and to achieve the ambition and the goals that we need to achieve in environmental concerns, well, it's going to be key. So thank you very much again, and we hope to continue to work with all the stakeholders, all those that are involved, because there are institutions that are involved, because the challenge is huge, but also the commitment that I believe many of us have, especially amidst this pandemic, is also big. It's a big commitment. So thank you, and we'll continue to work. Congratulations. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you for reminding us the ministry convention where we were invited to say, okay, we are going to share these results. Her voice froze again. I'm sorry, her voice keeps freezing. Her voice is buffering. I'm sorry. I think we have some problem with your connection.
Creo que no la escuchamos.
No, we cannot hear what she's saying.
A ver. Ahí. Bueno, ahí seguimos entonces con la próxima presentación.
Okay, we'll continue to the next presentation. Thank you, Rosa. Let's see if Piedad can get back later. And okay, I pass on the floor to Felipe Castro, the Deputy Director of the Center for... I'm sorry, his voice is buffering too.
Muy bellas, muy preciosas para...
Very nice, very kind. Thank you very much, Felipe, and you have the floor.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Pascual, por la introducción.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to thank you for inviting us. I want to congratulate Leo. I join the previous speakers to highlight the big contribution of this report. I believe that it's a key element. And in my 5 minutes, I'd like to highlight why this report is so important. First thing is that the SDGs have their own inertia, very much related to the Millennium Objectives that focus on social and economic components. The true new thing is the SDG agenda is precisely to continue to consolidate that inertia of social and economic progress. But while incorporating that environmental component, the environmental realm, which is the door to sustainable development, we cannot continue to battle poverty and continue to grow economically as we used to. It was very much connected with environmental degradation. It was 50, 60 years in that process. We are in the boundaries, the limits imposed by nature, and to think up of sustainable development means a change in that concept, that relation to nature. So in this report, yes, there are four elements that Piedad mentioned as how to restate that relation to nature. First is to disconnect a that economic progress, the development of with at the cost of environmental degradation, decarbonization to stop the loss of biodiversity, and to adapt to the greater vulnerability that we have because of our climate events, and finally create governance and society systems around the environmental concerns. So it's a key element, and many times when we talk about SDGs, we check the development plans, we look at them, we see the measures that are being implemented. What we realize is that we continue to make progress in the social and economic components, but the environmental realm is left behind. It's second place. So this report sends a strong message, and is the environmental dimension is the most important because dimension in sustainable development, even more than the social economic elements, because that's where we need to reverse those mistakes we've made. That's the first element. The second thing is very interesting to see also how we can take quantitative measures, not only in the environmental SDGs, not only the water, climate action, someone 14 and 15 on ecosystemic systems in sea and land, but also the other 13 SDGs. It's also important because precisely it's those threads that we're trying to untie. We need to stop seeing this as only it's from the Ministry of Environment, but all the ministries, even those that can do the most on the environment, as the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministries of Economy,
Desarrollo productivo. Entonces hay que sacar lo ambiental
Ministry
de
of Interior. And so we need to create awareness that it's not just the Ministry of Environment. And this report is a specific progress in that sense because it talks about how the other 13 SDGs have environmental components in all of them. Another interesting element is the board with the dashboard. It shows how much progress we have made, where we have drawbacks, and it also shows the something that we know is a big need of information. And that board is very interesting because in this exercise precisely we conducted at the beginning of this year to build an index that would measure the progress of the 17 SDGs in 24 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We realized when we compared 2015 to 2019, it was the picture of the report, that a great deal of the progress, the little progress that we were achieving in achieving SDGs precisely focus on the social and economic dimensions. The social dimension makes three times as much progress. The environmental and economic dimension advances six times as much as the environmental component. So the delay is there in these elements that are explained and presented in the report. And it's there where we have to make a change. There's where we have to create policies, generate measures, change behaviors if we actually want to comply with the SDGs. So I believe that it's a disruptive report that places it hits the nail right on the head, and we celebrate this report. Let's hope that will have cooperation opportunities in the future. Hopefully, many of the indexes and the indicators that are presented in the report can be used for the by the countries. It'll be very useful to continue to have this report periodically, because again, that's where we have the big challenges if we really want to make progress in achieving SDGs. So that's it. And once again, congratulations to Piedad, Leo, the whole team. They made a huge effort to produce this report, and count on us to spread it and have different spaces for discussion. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Felipe. Estoy de vuelta. Afortunadamente me pude volver a conectar. No sé qué
Thank you,
pasó.
Felipe. I'm glad to be back. I don't know what happened. I want to thank that you have identified that effort that we have tried to highlight the environmental component and also involve everyone in that effort to see that actually no one is exempt to consider the environmental concern. The environment is what we breathe, what we step, what we eat, what we step on. So it's normal, but we don't always have it at the top of our heads. It should not always be and only be the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment. or the civil society. So it's a big message, and thank you for highlighting that and uh, offering cooperation with your center. And yes, we'll try to strengthen our cooperation. Now, I want to pass on the floor to Professor Anthony Clayton from the Institute of Sustainable Development of the University of West Indies.
Gracias.
Us and welcome.
Gracias. Buenos días. Saludos desde Jamaica a todos. This is an excellent report. Very, very high quality work. There are a number of very troubling indicators and trends which are documented in this report. And I think we need to talk about two in particular. The first is that we are not making sufficient progress towards a low carbon or zero carbon economy. The report points out that there is slow growth in renewable energy technologies, but the region is still very largely dependent on fossil fuels, which are still subsidized. Now, if we stay on this current trajectory, we will have something like a 55% chance of a 4-degree rise in temperature by the end of this century. If we get that, many parts of the world will become uninhabitable because they will be too hot, too dry, or underwater. I think very few people understand the extent to which we are now committed to a much hotter future. Even if we manage to change this trend and implement all of the Paris Accords, we will still have a 43% chance of having a 3 or 4 degree rise by the end of the century. So when we look back, it may seem to a future generation that the subsidies that we're giving to fossil fuels may look like the greatest and most destructive folly in human history. This is a policy which absolutely has to change. The second very alarming trend documented in this report is that material consumption is still rising. Let me say why this is so troubling. Today, there are 7.8 billion people in the world. By the time we get to 2050, it will be nearly 10 billion. Today, just over half of humanity lives in cities. By the time we get to 2050, that will be 65 to 75% of humanity living in urban areas. What that means is there will be at least 2.5 billion people more people than today, living in urban settlements by the time we get to 2050, which is only 30 years away. If you do the math, what this means is that we are going to need to build 110 new cities, 3 or 4 new cities every year. And each of those cities will be the size of Mexico City today, a city of 22 million inhabitants. Unless we put the planning frameworks in place now, most of these new cities, a large part of them, will be favelas, informal settlements. And if we go down that road, by the time we get to 2050, we could have 30–40% of humanity living in favelas. Now, think about what this means in terms of material consumption by urban development. In 2010, the cities of the world consumed 40 billion tons of material. Every year. By 2050, the cities of the world will be consuming 90 billion tons of material every year. These are the fossil fuels, the sand, cement, gravel, steel, timber, water, and food absorbed into our urban centers. And this is impossible. The world cannot supply that level of resource consumption. So it is absolutely essential that we find more efficient models of construction and urban living and get off this increasingly untenable pathway. If we stay on the current path, we are moving into an increasingly difficult future. The report talks about environmental conflicts, but it's very important to understand that these are going to become the norm for much of humanity. By the time we get to 2050, over half of humanity will be living in water-stressed areas. We've already seen a number of wars fought over land and water, including wars in Sudan and the current conflict in Ethiopia Tigray province. But this is not just Africa. As the report points out, of the top 7 countries in the world for environmental conflicts, 4 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, the compounding factor, and this is the crucial missing dimension, this is not really addressed in this report, but it is absolutely essential to understand if you want to understand the implications of these environmental pressures. The compounding factor is that we already live in the most violent region in the world. In peaceful parts of the planet, like Europe, for example, homicide rates today are about 1 or 1.5 per 100,000 population. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the average homicide rate is over 30 per 100,000. And in Central America and the Caribbean, it's over 50 per 100,000. It's 50 times higher than in Europe. In this region, Latin America and the Caribbean, we have 8% of the population of the planet and nearly 40% of all the homicides in the world. Of the 50 most murderous cities in the world, 41 are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And about 80% of all of these murders occur on 2% of the streets. These are overwhelmingly concentrated in the informal settlements, the favelas that we've built in Latin America and the Caribbean. One of our communities, one of our informal settlements in Jamaica, had a homicide rate a few years ago that peaked at 140 per 100,000. This was about 4 times higher than in the government-controlled areas of Afghanistan, which is a war zone. The rate of killing in our favelas is higher than in most war zones. Now think about this for a minute as a global problem. Every year, there's about 450 to 550,000 violent deaths in the world every year. Less than 20% of them die in wars. Almost 70% of them die as a result of crime-related and domestic homicide. We actually have the world's biggest war, 4 times bigger than all other wars, conflicts put together, happening here in our favelas, in the favelas of the world, and most of those are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, we understand the factors that have led to this. It's a pattern of weak or corrupt or incompetent government. It's extreme inequality before the law, where well-connected criminals are beyond the reach of the police, and the police are behave typically brutally towards people who are not powerful. It's ready availability of weapons. It's the profits from narcotics, extortion, and so forth. It's overcrowded prisons. But one of the critical drivers is this pattern of rapid and chaotic urbanization, the development of informal settlements, and all of the social problems that go with that, broken and dysfunctional families, and many unemployed and disaffected young men. All of this, this report is telling us that we are going into a very bleak future, and we do not have much time left to sort this out. But we have the solution available to us. The key is to redesign our cities to achieve far higher levels of energy and resource efficiency, to absorb the expected population growth, and to reintegrate the marginalized and violent communities back so that people have a chance of a decent life. The good news is that this is perfectly possible. In Jamaica, we recently finished constructing the first net zero energy building in the Caribbean. This is a building that generates more power than it consumes. And if we could make every building in the world to that standard, we could reduce world energy demand by about 1/3, which would go a very long way to solving the problems of climate change. And in Jamaica, we are also trying to reintegrate our high crime communities. This is a very difficult problem, and we are not making very good progress, but we are trying. And this is something that I believe every country in the world will have to do in future, or at least all of those in Latin America and the Caribbean. So when we read this report, it's very important to understand that this documents a situation we're in today, but it's even more important to read the trends and to understand what this report is telling us, which is that we only have a limited amount of time to solve our social and our problems, to solve our political problems. Otherwise, we are going into a bleak future. But if we can solve these problems, then we can still turn the situation around and build a world that is better for everybody. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Clayton, to link all the issues included in the report in your presentation, and even with the call of urgency, provide us a solution and a way forward. I think that the experience of Jamaica is very good, and I think we can all dream on doing it better. But yes, we have a limited amount of time. Thank you very much for your intervention. And well, I would like to say that we are available, the report is available in the link shared. We are available to present it in any scenario that you might want us to. We are going to follow up with presentations to youth networks, universities, and other UN agencies. But we are open for any suggestion. And I would like now to pass the word to our director, Leo Heilemann, for a final remarks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for a wonderful launch and really excellent feedback. I have a sort of statement prepared, but I think I would deviate from that, because I think there are important lessons that come out from the feedback from the participants on this panel. Some of the things that struck me not only is the really grave situation that we are in right now, and what the report is telling us, and what the data is showing, and frankly what the Professor Clayton just told us about in terms of the gravity of the situation, that we are not making enough progress on low carbon, on reducing our consumption, on how our material consumption is increasing, and the world cannot sustain that level of consumption. And also the issue of the violence in the region, the social problems. I think what is important here for us are two really critical things. One of the issues raised by one of the panelists is really on the sustainability that we give to the report. Actually, Philip had mentioned this. What do we do now? And how do we use this important data and information that has been provided in the report to motivate and push change by the countries of the region, by the industries, by society? And I think that is what we need to do now with this information. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done now that we have this information in terms of advocacy in the region to get things to change. I think that is one of the key takeaways that I have from this. And then also on that same point that Philip raised on sustainability, we need to have that sort of constant updating, that system of the data analysis, that we can provide feedback on a regular basis throughout the year. And we are working with that within the organization from what we have created called our World Environment Situation Room, in terms of linking databases all over the world and in the region to have access to data that we could provide policy guidance with concrete information to the governments of the region. But how do we sustain that? So I think a key thing, at least for our office, is one, with the identification of these gaps and the data we have, moving to the advocacy to move change in the region, and two, ensuring that this type of analysis and report is available to governments and to the society at large on a regular basis. So this effort that really started as an ad hoc effort, and I have to say Piedad led this process and Philippe came on board as an intern and then as a consultant and did a phenomenal job. And then so many people participated in getting the information together and getting the analysis done. And now we have a concrete product which we need to use to its fullest. The information is surprising. It's quite worrying in terms of some of the trends. And as indicated by Professor Clayton, we are heading to a situation of disaster, not to mention worsening violence, but of disaster, environmental and sustainable development disaster in the region. So I would conclude with that as some of the key lessons we got from this. I want to thank all of the participants for sharing their knowledge, their expertise, and I'm sure they would continue to use this information in their own in working environment and in their partnerships. But I also want to give a sincere thanks to the team involved in making this report a reality. And by that, I would like to indicate and point out Piedad Martin, who was overall coordinating, Felipe Dal, who did a lot of the groundwork, Pilar Roman, who was with us and now is in Europe, I think, bond working now. She started up a lot of the work, Elsa Mort, and also the support we got from Ana Porras and Adrian Cordona, and many people in other divisions of UNEP, as well as partners who have provided comments and information from Panama, Montevideo, Kingston, Nairobi, Paris, Bogota. So really it has been a team effort. I want to invite you all to read the report. I want to invite you all to disseminate and to use it in advocacy, in trying to get real policy changes in the region, and that our decisions in the future reflect this information and can change what we see as the disastrous trends in the future. We can change those trends at this point in time. So thank you very much, everyone. It has been really a wonderful process, but really it's only the start of the work that I can see. And thank you all for guiding us and providing your inputs and suggestions for improvement and how this can be used much more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias. Bye.
Thank you everyone for participating, and adios. Hasta la próxima y a trabajar.
Goodbye, everybody. See you next